For 28 days, my wife hasn't spoken a single word to me. Today, I'm leaving her with white roses, a thank you note, and divorce papers. The silence was meant as punishment after I suggested moving the furniture to make room for my woodworking. Instead, it gave me the freedom to rediscover who I was before I started silencing myself to keep her happy. As I pick up my saxophone, an instrument she made me stop playing 15 years ago, I realize how much of myself I surrendered for peace. Her silent treatment was supposed to break me. Instead, it rebuilt me. After 6 decades of life, I finally learned that sometimes the greatest dignity lies in walking away. The argument that started it all seemed so trivial at the time. After dinner on a Tuesday evening in early October, I mentioned the maple wood I'd been saving in the garage for nearly 2 years. "I was thinking," I said, gesturing toward the living room's bay window, "we could move the sofa against the wall and shift the bookcase to where the side table is now. It would give me enough space for a small workbench by the window. The natural light would be perfect for detail work." Eleanor looked up from her magazine, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She had that immediate tightening around her mouth that I'd come to recognize over 35 years of marriage, the prelude to disapproval. "You want to do woodworking in our living room?" she asked, each word precisely measured. "Robert, that's what the garage is for." I ran my hand through my thinning gray hair, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied these conversations. "The garage has no windows, and you've filled it with holiday decorations and storage boxes," I reminded her gently. "I wouldn't make a mess. Just a small corner for fine work, maybe making those jewelry boxes you used to like." Her lips thinned into that familiar line of disapproval. "The living room is for living, not for sawdust and wood shavings. We've talked about this. Your hobbies can't take over our shared spaces." I'd heard variations of this refrain throughout our marriage. My woodworking tools had migrated from a dedicated workshop in our first home to a corner of the garage, then to a single cabinet. My saxophone had gone from nightly practice to weekend sessions to special occasions only, before finally disappearing into the attic 15 years ago after one too many comments about the noise disturbing her reading time. "I wouldn't be taking over," I said, that familiar sensation of making myself smaller washing over me. "Just that corner by the window. I've been retired for 3 years now, and I'd like to—" "We are not turning our living room into a workshop." Her voice had that finality I knew too well. "I don't understand why you need to change things that work perfectly fine." I looked around the living room, the beige sofa I'd never found comfortable, positioned precisely where Eleanor preferred it, the formal curtains that let in less light than I liked, the decorative pillows that served no purpose except aesthetics. Everything in the space reflected her preferences, accumulated over decades of small surrenders on my part. "Eleanor," I tried once more, "I'm just asking for a small space to—" She stood abruptly, cutting me off. "I don't want to discuss this anymore. You know how I feel about mess and noise. We're done talking about this." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving her magazine open on the arm of her chair. I expected her to return later that evening with the cold shoulder, her usual tactic when displeased, but she didn't return at all. When I went to bed, she was already lying there, facing away from me, her body rigid with disapproval. "Good night, Eleanor," I said, reaching to turn off my bedside lamp. She didn't respond. The next morning, I made coffee for 2 as usual, the rich aroma filling our kitchen as it had every morning for decades. "Sleep well?" I asked, placing her cup at her spot at the breakfast table. Silence. I tried again at breakfast. "Toast?" Nothing. By dinner, I understood what was happening. This wasn't just the cold shoulder. This was the silent treatment, complete communication blackout. I'd experienced this before, though never for something so trivial. 3 days when I invited friends over without adequate notice. A week when I bought a car she didn't approve of. 4 days when I suggested visiting my brother for Christmas instead of staying home. Each time, the silence had stretched until I'd apologized, usually for things that didn't warrant apology. But this time felt different. I hadn't done anything wrong. I just asked for a small piece of our shared space. On day 4, Tom from next door noticed something was off when he saw me watering Eleanor's prized roses alone, usually her sacred duty. "Everything all right with you two?" he asked, leaning over our shared fence, the October breeze ruffling his silver hair. "Eleanor's not speaking to me at the moment," I said, trying to sound casual, though the admission felt shameful. Tom's bushy eyebrows rose. "She's done this before, hasn't she?" His perception made me uncomfortable. Had our marriage dynamics been so transparent to outsiders? I nodded, adjusting the spray on the hose. "Just a disagreement. It'll blow over." "How long's it been?" 4 days. He whistled low. "Over what?" "I wanted to move some furniture to make space for woodworking." Tom looked genuinely puzzled, his weathered face creasing with confusion. "That's it. And she's giving you the complete silent treatment." "Rob, that doesn't seem proportional." His comment stayed with me as I finished watering Eleanor's roses, being careful to give each bush exactly the amount of water she preferred. Tom had articulated what I'd been feeling but couldn't quite name: the disproportionate nature of Eleanor's response. Silent treatment for days because I wanted a small corner of our home for my passion. It seemed increasingly unreasonable the more I thought about it. Each time Eleanor had deployed this tactic before, I'd eventually apologized, even when I wasn't wrong. I'd always been the one to break first, to surrender the high ground in exchange for domestic peace. This time felt different. I hadn't done anything that required forgiveness. I just asked for a small piece of our shared space. As I placed her dinner at her usual spot that evening, watching her eat without acknowledgement of my existence, I made a decision. I wouldn't apologize this time, not for wanting a corner of my own home. That night, I lay awake listening to Eleanor's measured breathing beside me, the distance between us far greater than the physical inches separating our bodies. 4 days of silence over something so small seemed absurd, yet I knew from experience it could go much longer. The bedroom ceiling offered no answers as I stared up at it, but a quiet resolution formed within me. This time, I wouldn't be the one to break the silence. This time, I would wait her out. By day 7, the silence had developed its own presence in our home, a third entity living between us, growing heavier with each passing hour. I began marking days on the kitchen calendar with small X's in the corner of each square. Eleanor noticed. I saw her eyes linger on them as she prepared her morning tea, but she maintained her silence with impressive discipline. The quiet was oppressive, yet strangely illuminating. Without conversation to fill our shared spaces, I began noticing things I'd overlooked for years. The way Eleanor arranged her side of the bathroom counter with military precision. How she would shift any object I left in a common area to match her preferred aesthetic. The subtle frown that appeared whenever I occupied her chair or used her mug. 1,000 tiny boundaries I'd unconsciously learned to navigate. On the morning of day 8, I decided to search for my old woodworking sketches. If the living room was off limits, perhaps I could reconfigure the guest bedroom that was rarely used. While Eleanor was at her sister Jessica's house, a Wednesday ritual she maintained despite our domestic Cold War, I climbed into the attic to look through my old files and design books. The attic was hot and dusty, filled with boxes neatly labeled in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Christmas decorations. Tax records 2010, 2015. Robert's old clothes. Each container represented another piece of our life together, categorized and stored according to Eleanor's organizational system. As I moved aside a box marked winter linens, my foot bumped against something solid. Brushing away a layer of dust revealed a black case I hadn't seen in 15 years, my saxophone. The brass was tarnished, the case's leather covering cracked with age. I'd been first chair in our community jazz band for a decade before Eleanor's complaints about the noise led me to practice less and less. "Couldn't you take up a quieter hobby?" she'd asked repeatedly. "The neighbors can hear you. I can't concentrate on my reading. It's just so intrusive." Eventually, I'd stored the instrument away, telling myself it was temporary, that I'd find another time and place to play. Yet 15 years had passed, and the saxophone had remained here, gathering dust, while my skills atrophied. I unlatched the case with trembling fingers. The instrument inside was exactly as I'd left it, mouthpiece removed, reed carefully stored, keys dulled but intact. I ran my fingers over the pearl inlays, remembering the way they'd felt beneath my fingertips during countless performances. The saxophone had been more than a hobby. It had been a voice, a means of expression I'd surrendered for the sake of domestic harmony. The realization hit me with unexpected force. The silent treatment wasn't new. I'd been experiencing versions of it throughout our marriage. Withdrawal of affection when I didn't comply with Eleanor's expectations. Silence when I expressed needs that inconvenienced her preferred routines. My entire home had become a space where I walked on eggshells, monitoring my words, actions, and desires to avoid triggering her disapproval. I carried the saxophone downstairs and placed it prominently on the coffee table, a deliberate act of visibility. Then I called my old friend David Chen, who still played with the community band every Thursday at the recreation center. We met at the coffee house 2 blocks from my house, neutral territory where I could speak freely without worrying about neighbors reporting back to Eleanor. "Robert Mason," David said, embracing me warmly, his familiar sandalwood cologne bringing back memories of late-night jam sessions. "Man, it's been years. The band's never found a sax player with your feel for Coltrane." He'd brought photos from our playing days, yellowed snapshots of middle-aged men with less gray hair and more expansive waistlines, instruments gleaming under stage lights. I barely recognized myself in those images. The man in the pictures had a confidence in his posture, a light in his eyes that had dimmed over the years. "What happened?" David asked after I explained my rediscovery of the instrument. "You just disappeared from the scene. We all thought maybe health issues." "Eleanor didn't like the noise," I said simply, stirring my coffee. David studied me over his cup, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "So you just stopped? Rob, you were talking about starting your own quartet. You had plans for a small studio space in your basement. You were writing your own compositions." I shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Marriage is about compromise. Compromise is a 2-way street. What did she give up for you? When I didn't answer immediately, he leaned forward. "She's been silencing you for years, just not literally." The truth of his statement resonated through me like a perfect chord. I told him about the current silent treatment, now in its 8th day, and how it had started over something as simple as wanting to move furniture. "And this is over furniture?" David shook his head, his silver-streaked ponytail swaying with the movement. "Rob, that's not normal. That's control." "I know," I admitted. "I've been thinking about that a lot this week." "Bring your sax to my place tomorrow," he said decisively. I'll help you clean it up, get it playing again. The old group gets together Thursdays. Nothing formal, just jamming. No pressure, but the door's open. I hesitated, instinctively thinking of Eleanor's reaction. I haven't played in 15 years. Music doesn't leave you, David said, tapping his chest. Not really. It goes dormant, but it's still in there, waiting. That night, I left the saxophone on the coffee table in the living room, a deliberate act of visibility. When Eleanor came in and saw it, she froze momentarily before pointedly ignoring both it and me. I waited until she was settled with her book before speaking. I found my old saxophone today, I said conversationally, as if we were having a normal exchange. David's going to help me get it playing again. I'm thinking of joining their Thursday night sessions. Her posture stiffened, the book in her hands lowering slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on the page. I could see they weren't moving, though. She wasn't reading, just maintaining the pretense. I know you can hear me, Eleanor. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you that I'll be playing music again. My voice remained calm, but I felt something shifting inside me, the first stirrings of reclamation. She stood abruptly and left the room, her book abandoned on the chair. I picked up the saxophone, brought it to my lips, and blew a tentative note. The sound was brassy and out of tune, the reed dry and unresponsive, but it filled the room with something that had been missing for too long, my voice. The next day, I took the saxophone to David's house. He lived alone in a small craftsman bungalow filled with musical instruments and artifacts from his travels as a session musician. Jazz played softly in the background as we disassembled the saxophone, cleaning years of dust from its mechanisms. It needs a good overhaul, David said, examining the pads, but the horn itself is solid, top quality. He looked up at me. You know, most people would have sold it after a few years of not playing. Why did you keep it? I considered his question carefully. I think part of me always hoped I'd come back to it someday. And that day is today, David said, handing me a new reed. Let's hear what you've got left. My first attempts were embarrassing. Weak tone, poor breath control, fingers fumbling over once familiar patterns. But by the end of the afternoon, muscle memory began to return. The first recognizable melody emerged from the instrument, shaky but identifiable. That's it, David encouraged. It's coming back, like riding a bicycle. When I returned home that evening, Eleanor was preparing dinner, her back to me as I entered. I placed the saxophone on its newly purchased stand in the corner of the living room, another deliberate act of reclamation. I had my first practice session today, I said to her back. It'll take time to get my embouchure back, but David thinks I could be playing with the group again within a few weeks. Her shoulders tensed visibly, but she continued chopping vegetables without turning. The silence between us had a different quality now, no longer merely her weapon against me, but a space I was beginning to fill with my own choices, my own voice. That night, I slept better than I had in days, the memory of music still vibrating through my fingertips. By the 14th day, our home had begun to transform. The silent treatment continued, but the power dynamic had shifted subtly. I'd moved a small table near the living room window, not a full workbench, but enough space to do some carving. I'd placed my old design books openly on the coffee table. My saxophone now stood on its stand in the corner of the living room, no longer hidden, but prominently displayed. Eleanor's silent fury was palpable, but she could hardly object without breaking her self-imposed communication embargo. Each morning, she would notice the small changes I'd made to our shared space, her lips tightening, her movements becoming more rigid, but the silence remained unbroken. I'd cleaned and relearned my saxophone with David's help, my fingers gradually remembering what they'd known so well before. The first session with his group had been humbling, my skills rusty, my embouchure weak, my timing uncertain. But by the second week, glimpses of my former musicality had returned. The joy of creation, of expression, flooded back with each note. At home, I played in the afternoons when Eleanor would normally be out with her garden club or visiting her sister. On this particular day, however, she'd canceled her garden club meeting without explanation. I was practicing a blues scale in the spare bedroom when I heard her on the phone in the kitchen. I wouldn't have eavesdropped, except I heard my name. "He's completely changed, Jessica. It's like he's having some kind of rebellion," Eleanor was saying to her sister. "First moving furniture without asking me, then digging out that horrible saxophone. He knows how I feel about the noise." I moved closer to the door, my saxophone silent in my hands. "No, I haven't spoken to him yet. He needs to understand how inappropriate this behavior is." A pause as her sister responded. "Of course it's working. He's always apologized before when he realizes how unreasonable he's being." Another pause. "Just hold out until he breaks, like last time." Her sister's response was inaudible. "I know it's been 2 weeks, but he'll come around. He always does." The cold calculation in her voice struck me like a physical blow. This wasn't an emotional response to a disagreement. This was a strategic maneuver, a manipulation tactic she'd used successfully before, confident in the knowledge that I would eventually capitulate as I always had. When I heard her end the call, I waited until she left for her rescheduled meeting with her sister before returning to the living room. I stood in the center of the space, suddenly seeing it with new eyes. Every piece of furniture, every decoration reflected Eleanor's taste. The beige sofa I'd never found comfortable. The formal dining set we used 3 times a year. The china cabinet filled with heirlooms from her family. The muted color scheme she preferred. The precisely arranged bookshelves where my books were relegated to the bottom shelves, out of immediate sight. Where was I in this space? What part of this home carried my imprint? I played my saxophone that afternoon, louder than I had in decades, filling the house with sound. Each note felt like a declaration. I exist. I matter. This is also my home. That evening, when Eleanor returned, I was still playing, a mournful rendition of Round Midnight that had always moved me. She walked past the living room without acknowledgement, but I saw her flinch at the sound. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't stop playing when she entered. I finished the piece, each note a reclamation. When the final note faded, I made a decision. I carried my pillow and personal items from our bedroom to the guest room. I wouldn't share a bed with someone who could so coldly discuss me as a problem to be managed, who could use silence as a weapon against my simplest requests for space and self-expression. The guest room had always been Eleanor's domain, decorated for her occasional visitors, maintained according to her standards. Now I claimed it as my own space, placing my saxophone on the dresser, my books on the nightstand, my clothes in the closet. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a space that was truly mine. As I arranged my things, I felt a weight lifting. The walls that had been closing in for years, invisible barriers of expectation and disappointment, seemed less solid now. I was creating space for myself not by changing our physical environment, but by changing how I responded to her tactics. That night, Eleanor paused outside the guest room door. I could see her shadow beneath it. She stood there for nearly a minute before moving away without knocking. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't the one seeking reconciliation. The realization carried a bittersweet power. I slept better that night than I had in years, my saxophone case open beside the bed, a tangible reminder of the self I was reclaiming. The next morning, I made coffee as usual, setting Eleanor's cup at her place. When she entered the kitchen and saw me, there was a momentary softening in her expression, a hint of uncertainty. She'd expected me to break by now, to beg forgiveness, to return to the pattern we'd established over decades. My calm demeanor and continued independence clearly unsettled her. "I'm going to practice with David's group again today," I said conversationally, as if the 2 week silence between us was perfectly normal. "Don't wait dinner for me." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her silence, sipping her coffee with deliberate focus on the newspaper beside her. I left the house with my saxophone, a strange lightness in my step. For the first time, I saw Eleanor's silence not as punishment, but as opportunity. Every day she refused to speak was another day I could reclaim pieces of myself without negotiation or compromise. If Eleanor wanted silence, I would fill it with music. If she wanted control, I would respond with liberation. The path forward was becoming clearer with each day of her intended punishment. Sometimes walls need to be recognized before they can be dismantled. On day 18, I called Sarah Jenkins, the attorney who had handled my mother's estate 5 years earlier. Her office was downtown, safely away from any prying eyes in our neighborhood. The brass nameplate on her door gleamed in the morning light as I entered her office, a space designed for both comfort and professionalism, with warm wood tones and tasteful art on the walls. "Divorce after 35 years is complex, Mr. Mason," she said after I explained my situation, "but not uncommon. What's prompted this decision now?" I told her about the silent treatment, now in its 3rd week, and the patterns it had forced me to recognize. "This isn't about the silence itself," I explained, running my hand over the arm of the leather chair where I sat. "It's about what it revealed. I've spent decades compromising who I am to maintain peace. I don't blame Eleanor entirely. I allowed it to happen. But I can't continue living this way." Sarah nodded, her expression free of judgment. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes shrewd but kind. "Has there been any infidelity, abuse, or financial misconduct I should be aware of?" "No," I said honestly. "Just a fundamental incompatibility that I've been ignoring for too long. In cases like yours, I often recommend attempting counseling first," she said, making a note in her legal pad. "Have you considered that option?" I smiled ruefully. "That would require my wife to speak to me." Sarah's lips quirked slightly. "Fair point." She began outlining what a divorce would entail: division of assets, potential alimony considerations, the timeline we could expect. We were financially comfortable. I had my teacher's pension and savings, while Eleanor had her own inheritance and investments. The house would be the most significant asset to address. "What about emotional preparation?" I asked. "I've been married for 35 years. I'm not sure I know how to be single anymore." Sarah's expression softened. "That's a very insightful question, Mr. Mason. Many clients focus solely on the legal aspects without considering the personal adjustment. Do you have a support system? Friends, family, activities that bring you joy?" "I'm rebuilding those connections now," I said, thinking of David and the music group. "And rediscovering old passions." "That's excellent. I'd also suggest considering therapy for yourself, regardless of whether your wife participates. This is a significant life transition." "I'll look into that," I promised. "I can have preliminary paperwork ready for you by next week," she said. "But I'd recommend not serving them until you're absolutely certain this is what you want." I thought about the saxophone now proudly displayed on a stand in the guest room, about the woodworking projects I'd begun at David's garage, about the profound silence that had paradoxically given me space to hear my own voice again. "I'll know for certain very soon," I told her. That afternoon, I began transforming our rarely used garden shed into a proper workshop. The space was small, but had a window and enough room for a workbench. I spent hours cleaning out holiday decorations and garden supplies, installing proper lighting, and setting up my old tools that had been gathering dust in the garage corners. The physical labor felt good, productive, and purposeful. Each nail I hammered, each surface I sanded, each tool I arranged was an act of reclamation. This space would be mine, designed for my comfort and creativity rather than conforming to someone else's aesthetic preferences. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as I worked, her silence no longer feeling like punishment, but permission. Every time I looked up and caught her observing, she would quickly turn away, but not before I glimpsed the confusion in her expression. This wasn't following the script of our previous conflicts. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't seeking reconciliation. I was building something new. By day 21, I had also changed my appearance. I visited my barber for a new haircut, shorter on the sides, more modern than the conservative style Eleanor preferred. I bought clothes that reflected my taste rather than her approval. Comfortable jeans instead of pressed slacks, colorful shirts instead of the muted tones she considered appropriate for a man my age. When I played with David's group that Thursday, wearing my new clothes and sporting my new haircut, a woman in the audience approached me afterward. "You play with such feeling," she said. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with short silver hair and bright eyes. "Are you new to the group?" "Returning after a long absence," I replied. "Well, welcome back," she said with a warm smile. "You were meant to make music." The simple validation from a stranger brought unexpected emotion to my throat. I had been meant to make music, to create with my hands, to take up space in the world. How had I forgotten that? At home, I continued the methodical transformation of our shared space. I moved my books from the bottom shelves of the bookcase to eye level. I hung a small jazz poster in the hallway. I replaced the uncomfortable decorative pillows on the sofa with ones I could actually lean against. Each change was subtle but deliberate, not to antagonize Eleanor, but to establish my presence in our home. She noticed each modification, her disapproval evident in the tightening of her lips, but her commitment to silence prevented any objection. In the workshop I'd created from the garden shed, I began a new project, a jewelry box made from the maple wood I'd been saving. My hands remembered the work better than I'd expected, finding comfort in the familiar motions of measuring, cutting, sanding. There was something profoundly satisfying about creating something tangible, something that would exist in the world because of my efforts. By day 25, I had arranged with David to stay in his guest room after I delivered the divorce papers. I began packing essential items when Eleanor was out with her sister. Nothing obvious, just gradual preparation for departure. A few favorite books, my most comfortable clothes, the fountain pen my father had given me when I graduated college. Sarah called to confirm the paperwork would be ready on day 29. The symmetry felt appropriate. 28 days of silence, followed by my response on the 29th day. "Are you certain about this timeline?" she asked. "Absolutely," I replied. "It's time to stop waiting for permission to live my life." That night, Eleanor tried to break her silence for the first time. As I was preparing for bed in the guest room, she appeared in the doorway. "Robert, I think we should—" I held up my hand gently. "Not now, Eleanor. We can talk on day 29. You chose 28 days of silence. I'm respecting your choice." Her face registered shock at my interruption. She was used to me eagerly accepting any crumb of communication after her silent treatments. This time was different. I was different. "Good night," I said politely, closing the door. As I lay in bed, I felt neither anger nor anxiety, just a profound certainty that I was finally on the right path. Eleanor's silent treatment hadn't broken me. It had freed me to hear the music I'd been silencing for decades. By day 26, our home had been transformed, not dramatically, but noticeably. The guest room now openly displayed my saxophone on its stand, sheet music scattered across the dresser. My woodworking tools had migrated from the garden shed to a small table beneath the living room window. Not the full workshop I'd initially requested, but a deliberate statement of presence. Eleanor's silent treatment had begun to falter. She'd made several attempts to initiate conversation, each time met with my polite deferral to day 29. The power dynamic had shifted palpably. Her silence, intended as punishment, had become my opportunity. I practiced saxophone daily now, no longer waiting for her absence. The house filled with music, sometimes melancholy, sometimes joyful, always authentic. I'd reconnected with skills I thought lost. Muscle memory, returning with each session. David had even suggested I take a solo at their next public performance. "You've got your tone back," he told me after our last practice. "And something else. Confidence. You play like you mean it now." On the morning of day 27, I received a text from Sarah Jenkins confirming the divorce papers were ready. I arranged to pick them up that afternoon while Eleanor visited her sister, a weekly ritual she'd maintained despite our domestic Cold War. Sarah reviewed the documents with me in her office, sunlight streaming through the windows onto the polished surface of her desk. "Everything looks in order, Robert. Are you still comfortable with the division of assets as we discussed?" I nodded. The terms were fair, generous even. Eleanor would keep the house, while I would take my pension and half our savings. At 63, I had no desire for a protracted legal battle. I wanted freedom, not vengeance. "And you're certain about the timing?" Sarah asked, her pen poised above the final document. "Tomorrow will be day 29 of this silent treatment. That seems precisely calculated." I smiled. "It's not about punishment, Sarah. It's about symmetry." She chose silence as her statement. "I'm making mine with equal deliberation." On my way home, I stopped at the florist and ordered white roses for delivery the following morning. The shop was filled with the sweet scent of flowers, colorful blooms arranged in elegant displays. White roses symbolize new beginnings, the florist told me as she wrote up the order. They're often used for weddings. "Or endings that lead to beginnings," I replied. When she asked about a card, I wrote the message carefully. "Thank you for the best month of our marriage. Your silence gave me the space to remember who I am." That evening, Eleanor made her most direct attempt to break the silence. She stood in the doorway of the guest room where I was reading, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. "This has gone on long enough, Robert. We need to talk about what's happening." I looked up from my book, marking my place with a finger. "I agree completely." "And we will, tomorrow, day 29. Why are you being so stubborn about this?" Frustration edged her voice. "I'm not being stubborn, Eleanor. I'm respecting the boundary you established 27 days ago when you decided silence was the appropriate response to my request for space. You've had 27 days to communicate. I've had 27 days to reflect. We'll talk tomorrow." She stood there, clearly struggling with this reversal of our usual pattern. Typically, I would have eagerly accepted any opening for reconciliation. This time, I was establishing the terms. "Fine," she finally said, turning away. "Tomorrow, then." After she left, I finished packing a suitcase with essentials I would take to David's. I placed it in the trunk of my car under cover of darkness. Everything was prepared. I slept soundly that night, my mind clear, my path certain. The silence that had begun as her weapon had become my ally, giving me clarity I'd lacked for years. Tomorrow, it would end on my terms. Morning arrived, with pale sunlight filtering through the guest room blinds. I dressed carefully in clothes that represented the reclaimed Robert. Comfortable but dignified, a blue shirt that David's group had complimented, slacks that I'd chosen without considering Eleanor's preferences. The florist delivered the white roses at 9 o'clock. I arranged them on the kitchen table, their pure white blooms elegant against the dark wood. Beside them, I placed the envelope containing divorce papers and my handwritten note. Eleanor was in the shower when the delivery arrived. I heard the water stop as I finished the arrangement. Perfect timing. I stood by the table, waiting for her to emerge. She appeared in her robe, hair wrapped in a towel. She stopped abruptly when she saw me standing there, then noticed the roses. "What's this?" she asked, approaching cautiously. "Today is day 29, I said simply. "The day we talk." She touched one of the rose petals tentatively. "You bought me flowers? After how I've treated you?" "Read the note," I replied quietly. Her face changed as she read my message, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension as she opened the envelope and saw the divorce papers beneath my note. "You can't be serious," she whispered, papers trembling in her hand. "Divorce? Over a silly argument about furniture?" "This isn't about furniture, Eleanor. It never was." My voice remained calm, the product of 28 days of clarity. "It's about 35 years of small silences. It's about a saxophone in the attic and woodworking tools in the garage. It's about a home where I've become invisible." "That's not fair," she protested. "Marriage is about compromise. Compromise is mutual. What I've been doing is surrender." I gestured around us. "Look at this house, Eleanor. Where am I in it? What part of this space reflects who I am?" Her eyes darted around, as if seeing our home through my perspective for the first time. The precisely arranged shelves, the decorative items that held no meaning for me, the formal dining room we rarely used. "We can change that," she said quickly, setting the papers down. "Move whatever furniture you want. Play your saxophone. I'll adjust." I shook my head gently. "It's too late for that. These 28 days showed me something important. I like who I am when I'm not trying to avoid your disapproval. I like the music I play, the things I create, the space I occupy." "So you're just leaving, after 35 years? "I'm not just leaving. I'm choosing myself after decades of choosing peace at any cost." I touched one of the roses gently. "Your silence truly was a gift, Eleanor. It gave me room to hear myself again." As the reality sank in, her expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and the beginning of panic. The control she'd wielded so effectively for decades was slipping away. "You can't do this," she said, her voice hardening as she clutched her robe tighter around herself. "Where will you go? What will people think? I've arranged a place to stay. As for what people will think, that's no longer my primary concern." I picked up my keys from the counter. "I've packed what I need for now. We can arrange for the rest later through Sarah." "Sarah? You've already talked to a lawyer?" The betrayal in her voice would have wounded me deeply just a month ago. Now I recognized it as part of the pattern, her feelings prioritized over my needs. "Yes," I said simply. "The terms are fair. Take time to review them." As I moved toward the door, Eleanor stepped into my path. Her hair was still wrapped in a towel, her face bare of makeup, making her look vulnerable in a way I rarely saw her. "Robert, please, we can work this out. I'll go to counseling. I'll change." I looked at her with genuine compassion. "I believe you mean that right now. But we both know patterns don't change overnight. I need to do this for me. After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me? With divorce papers and sarcastic thank you notes?" There was no sarcasm in my note, Eleanor. I am genuinely thankful for these 28 days. They've been the most clarifying of our marriage. With that, I gently moved past her toward the door. She followed, still protesting, still trying to regain control of the narrative. For the first time in our marriage, I walked away from conflict rather than trying to resolve it on her terms. As I stepped outside, the morning air felt different, lighter somehow. 29 days ago, I had asked for a small corner of space in our home. Today, I was claiming something far more valuable, the right to exist fully as myself. "She tried to block your car?" David asked, as he helped me bring my suitcase into his guest room. "That seems a bit dramatic." "She wasn't expecting this outcome," I replied, setting down my saxophone case carefully beside the bed. In the past, I always broke first. After leaving the house, Eleanor had followed me to the driveway, alternating between angry accusations and tearful pleas. When those failed to sway me, she'd positioned herself behind my car, forcing me to wait until her sister arrived to calm her down. Jessica had glared at me with undisguised hostility as I finally drove away, as if I were committing some unforgivable betrayal by choosing my own happiness. "How are you feeling?" David asked, studying my face for signs of doubt or regret. I considered the question carefully, taking stock of the emotions swirling within me. Lighter, sad, but certain. "It's the right decision. 35 years is a long time," he observed, helping me hang my clothes in the closet. "Yes," I agreed. "Too long to spend diminishing yourself." David's home was comfortable in a way mine hadn't been. Lived in, personal, filled with objects that reflected his passions and experiences. Musical instruments shared space with books and travel souvenirs. The furniture was chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Nothing matched perfectly, yet everything belonged. "Mi casa es su casa," David said, gesturing around the room. "Stay as long as you need. I'm gone most weekends for gigs, so you'll have plenty of space." "I appreciate it," I said, genuinely moved by his generosity. "I'll start looking for an apartment next week." That afternoon, Eleanor called repeatedly. I let the calls go to voicemail, listening to her messages evolve from anger to bargaining. "You're being ridiculous, Robert," the first one began. By the 6th, "Please come home. We can work this out. I'll make changes. You don't need to throw away 35 years over a misunderstanding." I texted a simple response. "I need space to process. We'll contact you about next steps through Sarah." Sarah called to confirm Eleanor had contacted her, angry and confused. "She claims she was blindsided," Sarah said. "Says this came out of nowhere after decades of what she thought was a happy marriage." "That's her perspective," I replied, watching the autumn leaves swirl outside David's kitchen window. "From mine, it's been building for decades. The silent treatment was just the catalyst that helped me see things clearly." The following day, I met with Sarah to discuss next steps. Eleanor had refused to sign the papers, insisting on a reconciliation attempt first. "That's her right," Sarah explained, tapping her pen against her legal pad. "But it doesn't change the outcome if you remain committed to this path. It just extends the timeline." "I am committed," I confirmed. "This isn't an impulsive decision. It's been 35 years in the making." We established a timeline, a mandatory waiting period, mediation sessions, potential court dates, if agreement couldn't be reached amicably. The process takes time, Sarah cautioned, especially if one party is resistant. Are you prepared for that? Time was something I now felt rich in, rather than constrained by. At 63, I had rediscovered parts of myself I'd thought long lost. The saxophone that had remained silent for 15 years now filled David's home with music each morning. My hands, which had forgotten the pleasure of creating, now itched to return to woodworking. I'd even contacted the Community Arts Center about teaching music to seniors, something Eleanor had discouraged as unnecessary when I'd first retired. I'm prepared, I told Sarah. I've waited this long. I can wait a bit longer to do things properly. A week after leaving, I agreed to meet Eleanor at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. Sarah had advised against meeting alone at the house. Keep boundaries clear, she'd cautioned. Meeting in your shared home sends mixed messages about your intentions. Eleanor arrived, looking both put together and fragile. Her appearance carefully maintained, but with shadows beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. She'd chosen a table in the corner, away from other patrons, and had already ordered my usual coffee, a gesture I recognized as an attempt to recreate normalcy. "You look different," she said as I sat down. It wasn't what I'd expected her to open with. "I feel different," I replied honestly. "This rebellion—" "It's not a rebellion, Eleanor," I interrupted gently. "That implies I'm acting against some legitimate authority. This is a reclamation." She looked down at her untouched coffee, fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I've been talking to Jessica. She thinks you're having a midlife crisis." I couldn't help but laugh. "At 63? That would be quite delayed." "Then what would you call it?" A edge crept into her voice. "Walking out on your wife of 35 years without warning? Growth, awakening, choosing authenticity over peace at any cost." I took a sip of the coffee she'd ordered. Too milky, not hot enough, just as she always ordered it despite my preferences. The irony wasn't lost on me. "And it wasn't without warning, Eleanor. I've been expressing needs for years that were consistently dismissed." "You're talking like you've joined some kind of cult," she said dismissively. "This isn't you, Robert." "That's exactly the problem," I said, maintaining my calm. "You believe you know who I am better than I do. The quiet, accommodating husband who gives up his passions to keep you comfortable. That's who you want me to be." "But that's not all of who I am." "I never asked you to give up anything," she protested, color rising in her cheeks. "Not directly, but your disapproval, your silence, your constant reshaping of our environment to suit only your preferences. They spoke volumes. Do you remember when I stopped playing saxophone?" She shifted uncomfortably. "You lost interest. It happens." "No, Eleanor. I loved playing. I stopped because you complained about the noise every time I practiced. You said it gave you headaches. You suggested quieter hobbies repeatedly until I finally put it away rather than face your disapproval." "That's an exaggeration," she said, though her eyes flickered away from mine. "Is it? What about my woodworking? First confined to the garage, then to a single cabinet. My books relegated to the bottom shelves. My preference for color dismissed as too loud. My friends gradually excluded because they were too boisterous for your taste. So this is punishment for not letting you put a workbench in the living room." I shook my head. "This is me recognizing that I deserve to exist fully in my own home, in my own life. The silent treatment you intended as punishment became my liberation. I'm grateful for that clarity." Her eyes narrowed. "You're enjoying hurting me." "No, Eleanor. I take no pleasure in your pain, but I'm no longer willing to hurt myself to maintain your comfort." Our conversation continued in circles, her attempts to reframe my decision as selfishness, immaturity, or cruelty, my steady insistence on my right to authenticity. We parted without resolution, though I sensed the beginning of realization in her eyes that this change was not temporary. 3 weeks after leaving, I returned to the house with David to collect more of my belongings. Eleanor was visiting her sister, as arranged through our lawyers. The house already felt different, less like home, more like a museum of our past life together. I collected my books, remaining clothes, and personal mementos efficiently. In the attic, I found boxes of my things that had been gradually relocated there over the years: collections, hobby supplies, albums. Each box represented another small surrender, another piece of myself tucked away for Eleanor's comfort. "Man, there's a whole life up here," David observed, helping me carry boxes down to his truck. "All these jazz records, your photography equipment. Did you used to take pictures?" "I had a dark room in our first house," I said, running my fingers over the dusty camera case. "Black and white photography. I loved it." "What happened?" "Eleanor thought the chemicals smelled too strong, and the space could be better used as a guest room." David shook his head. "And you just gave it up?" "One compromise at a time. Each one seemed small enough in the moment." By the time Eleanor initiated divorce mediation 7 weeks after I left, I had established a new rhythm to my days. Mornings began with saxophone practice, afternoons with woodworking at the community center's shared studio, evenings with friends long neglected during my marriage. I'd rented a small apartment close to the arts center where I now taught twice weekly. The apartment was nothing special, a one-bedroom unit in a building popular with retirees, but it was mine. I arranged it according to my preferences, with my saxophone stand prominently displayed in the living room, my woodworking projects on shelves, my books organized by subject rather than size and color, as Eleanor had insisted. The walls, once white, I painted in warm colors, a soft gold in the living room, a peaceful blue in the bedroom. Colors that reflected my taste, not chosen to please someone else. In mediation, Eleanor presented herself as the wronged party, describing my departure as sudden and inexplicable. When the mediator asked for my perspective, I spoke without anger or blame. For 28 days, my wife chose not to speak to me because I asked for space for my creative work, I explained simply. During that silence, I realized how much of myself I had gradually surrendered to maintain peace. This isn't a sudden decision, but the culmination of decades of small compromises that eroded my sense of self. The mediator, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Mason, how would you characterize your communication during disagreements?" Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I sometimes need space to process my feelings." "By completely ignoring your husband's existence for 4 weeks?" the mediator asked neutrally. Her discomfort grew visible. "That may have been excessive," she conceded, the first crack in her narrative. "Has this happened before?" Eleanor hesitated. "There have been periods of reduced communication when we've had disagreements." "Mr. Mason, how would you describe these periods?" "Silent treatment," I said simply. "Complete communication blackout until I apologized, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. The longest before this was a week, when I bought a car she didn't approve of." The mediator made notes on her pad. "And you felt these were effective ways to resolve conflict, Mrs. Mason?" Eleanor's composure faltered slightly. "They worked," she said finally, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, They helped us move past disagreements. They worked because I always capitulated, I added quietly, not because anything was resolved. It was the first acknowledgment that her behavior had been disproportionate. A small crack in the narrative she had constructed about our marriage. Exactly 90 days after I left white roses on our kitchen table, our divorce was finalized. Eleanor ultimately accepted the terms I had initially proposed, perhaps recognizing that prolonging the process wouldn't change the outcome. The house would be sold, with proceeds divided equally. We each kept our respective retirement accounts and personal property. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor approached me one last time. She looked older somehow, but also more authentic than I'd seen her in years. The careful mask she'd worn throughout our marriage had slipped, revealing something more vulnerable beneath. "I still don't fully understand what happened," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's part of why this was necessary." She nodded slowly. "Your saxophone playing, it wasn't actually that bad." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. I accepted it with a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." As we parted ways, legally finally, I felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that sometimes walking away is the highest form of self-respect. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I performed my first saxophone solo with David's group at the Blue Note, a small jazz club downtown. The place was dimly lit, intimate, with tables crowded close to the small stage. The scent of coffee and wine mingled with the faint traces of decades of cigarette smoke embedded in the walls before smoking bans took effect. My fingers found the notes with a confidence that had returned fully now, my breath control better than even in my younger years. When I closed my eyes during the most emotional passage of My Funny Valentine, I felt completely present in the music, in my body, in my life. The sound that emerged from my saxophone was rich and complex, not technically perfect, perhaps, but alive with authentic feeling. The audience's applause afterward warmed something deep within me, not because I needed validation, but because it represented connection, my authentic expression received and appreciated by others. Real communication, nothing held back. After the show, David introduced me to the club's owner, a tall man with salt and pepper dreadlocks and a quick smile. "That saxophone solo was something special," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "You play like a man who understands what the music is saying. Got any interest in a regular monthly gig? We need a house band for Thursday nights." "I'd be honored," I replied, surprised at the offer, but immediately drawn to the possibility. A regular commitment to play, to create, to share my music with others. It was more than I would have dared hope for a year ago. My apartment had become a true reflection of who I was. Bookshelves filled with titles I actually read, walls displaying jazz prints and photographs, a dedicated corner for my saxophone and sheet music, and a small but functional workbench by the window. The jewelry boxes I'd begun crafting again were displayed on shelves, some given as gifts to friends, others sold at the local artisans' market. I'd also reclaimed my love for photography, setting up a small digital darkroom on my computer. The technology had changed dramatically since my film days, but the creative eye remained the same. I found myself capturing images of musicians at the club, the play of light and shadow on their faces as they lost themselves in performance. The community center, where I taught music to seniors, had become a source of unexpected joy. My students, mostly people my age or older, approached learning with the freedom that comes from creating art purely for its own sake. We laughed at mistakes, celebrated small victories, and formed a community around shared creativity. "You're a natural teacher, Robert," the program director told me during a quarterly review. The feedback from your students is exceptional. Would you consider expanding your classes next semester? We have a waiting list for your saxophone basics course. Teaching had never been part of my post-retirement plan, or rather, Eleanor's plan for my retirement, but it had become one of my greatest joys. Guiding others toward their own creative expression felt like a natural extension of my reclaimed voice. One Sunday morning in early spring, almost a year after the divorce was finalized, I was selling my handcrafted jewelry boxes at the local artisan market when I noticed Eleanor approaching my booth. She paused several feet away, clearly uncertain about how I would receive her. She looked different, her hair styled in a more relaxed way than the rigid bob she'd maintained during our marriage, her clothing softer, less formal. The separation had changed her too, it seemed. I nodded politely, acknowledging her presence without either warmth or coldness. "These are beautiful," she said, gesturing to the boxes displayed on my table. "I always knew you were talented." "Thank you," I replied simply. "You look well," she continued, studying my face. "Happy." "I am," I confirmed. We stood in silence for a moment, not the weaponized silence of our marriage's end, but the natural pause between two people who once shared a life and now moved in different orbits. "I've been seeing a therapist," she finally said, her fingers tracing the inlay on one of my boxes. "She's helped me understand some things about how I communicate, or don't communicate." I nodded, appreciating her effort, but not feeling obligated to make it easier for her. "I'm sorry, Robert. For the silent treatments, for not seeing what they did to you." The apology was unexpected but sincere. I accepted it with a simple, "Thank you for saying that." "Your work is selling well?" she asked, changing the subject. "Yes, I can barely keep up with orders. The community center's letting me use their workshop for larger projects now." Another pause, comfortable in its way. "The house sold last week," she said, "over asking price. Sarah mentioned that. I'm glad. I'm moving to Tucson. My sister thinks the climate would be better for my arthritis." "I hope it helps," I said genuinely. Despite everything, I didn't wish her ill. She touched one of the jewelry boxes gently, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "I still have the first one you made me, the rosewood with mother-of-pearl inlay." "I remember it," I said. It had been a 5th anniversary gift before the patterns of our marriage had fully calcified. "Well," she said after another moment, "I should let you get back to your customers. Take care, Robert. You too, Eleanor." As she walked away, I felt no regret, no second thoughts. The conversation had been civil, even healing in its way, but it only confirmed the rightness of my decision. We had become different people, or perhaps I had finally become myself while she was beginning her own journey toward authenticity. That evening, while practicing a new piece on my saxophone, I was struck by how the music filled my apartment, no longer apologetic, no longer muted to avoid complaint. The notes soared and dipped according to my interpretation alone. The freedom was intoxicating. After practice, I worked on a new jewelry box design at my workbench by the window. The maple wood grain caught the evening light, revealing patterns I might have missed in dimmer conditions. This, too, was freedom, creating without constraint, without consideration of whether my passion was too messy, too noisy, too inconvenient for someone else's comfort. A week later, David introduced me to Marina, a cellist who sometimes played with his group. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and lively eyes. "You should hear Robert's take on Coltrane," he told her as we shared a table at the Blue Note after a performance. "He brings something special to it." "I'd love to hear that," she said with genuine interest. "I've been working on some jazz classical fusion pieces that might benefit from a good saxophone line." We arranged to meet for coffee, to discuss musical collaboration. The conversation flowed easily, touching on our shared love of improvisation, the emotional language of music, and the joy of creating something new. When she mentioned having a small woodworking shop in her garage, the connection deepened further. "I mostly do small items, boxes, picture frames," she explained. "Nothing elaborate, but it's satisfying to make something tangible after the ephemeral nature of music." "I understand completely," I said, feeling a spark of recognition. "There's something about working with your hands that grounds you." As our coffee meeting extended into lunch, I realized I was experiencing something I had almost forgotten: the pleasure of connecting with someone who saw me fully and found value in what they saw. Whether this would develop into friendship, creative partnership, or something more remained to be seen. What mattered was that I was entering any new relationship as my complete self. By the 1-year anniversary of the day I left white roses and divorce papers on our kitchen table, my life had transformed entirely. I was teaching 4 music classes a week, performing regularly with David's group, and selling my woodworking creations through 3 different local shops. My photography was gaining recognition, with a small exhibition scheduled at the community center gallery. My social circle had expanded to include fellow musicians, craftspeople, and teachers, relationships based on shared passions rather than obligation. I'd reconnected with my brother in Colorado, spending 2 weeks hiking with him in the mountains, another passion Eleanor had discouraged as too risky at our age. My 64th birthday, celebrated with a jam session at the Blue Note, followed by dinner with friends, felt like a true new beginning rather than a milestone of decline. The energy I had once spent maintaining an uncomfortable peace was now channeled into creation, connection, and authentic living. That night, after my friends had gone home, I sat in my apartment with my saxophone in my lap, not playing, but simply feeling its weight, its potential. The silence around me was comfortable now, a space for reflection rather than punishment, a canvas awaiting music rather than a void of disconnection. I thought about the 28 days of silence that had changed everything. What Eleanor had intended as control had instead freed me to hear my own voice again. The irony wasn't lost on me, that her most controlling act had broken her control entirely, that silence had given birth to music, that an ending had created space for new beginnings. Sometimes, I realized, the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes what breaks us open is exactly what we need to become whole. Silence can be a weapon or a blessing, depending on who wields it and why. In my case, 28 days of intended punishment became the doorway to liberation I didn't know I needed. The quiet space created by my wife's withdrawal allowed me to hear the music I'd been silencing for decades. Not just the notes of my saxophone, but the authentic rhythm of my own heart. We often surrender pieces of ourselves so gradually that we don't notice their absence until something disrupts the pattern. A request denied, a passion discouraged, a voice diminished. These small compromises accumulate over years until we're living in homes where we've become guests, in relationships where we're playing parts rather than being ourselves. The true tragedy isn't that we change for those we love. It's that we forget what we're changing from, who we were before the surrender began. Dignity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply picks up an instrument that's gathered dust for 15 years. Sometimes it moves furniture without asking permission. Sometimes it leaves roses and walks away from decades of compromise. At 63, I discovered that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about recognizing when the battle has cost too much of your essential self. If you've ever silenced your own music to keep someone else comfortable, know that the instrument still waits for your touch. If you've made yourself smaller to maintain peace, know that there is space in this world for your full presence. The years we've lived don't diminish our right to authenticity. They make it more essential. Life is too precious to play it in someone else's key when our own music remains unheard. Listen for it. Play it. It's never too late to create the symphony that only you can compose.